There's a castle in Austria that looks like every fairy tale you've ever read. Rising from an island in the middle of a lake, medieval towers reflected in still water, stone bridges connecting to manicured parkland, Gothic windows catching afternoon light, romantic turrets reaching skyward. Everything tourists imagine when they picture the perfect medieval castle. Except it's not medieval. For the next 2 hours, we'll explore this strange monument to delusion and decline. We'll separate documented historical fact from Habsburg mythology. This is Franzensburg, not Austria's greatest castle, that's Schönbrunn or Hofburg. Not its oldest, dozens of genuine medieval fortresses exist, but its strangest, most revealing, most psychologically complex, the fake fortress that tells deeper truth about Habsburg decline than any genuine ruin ever could. Chapter 1. The Real Castle and the Medieval Foundations, 1200 to 1529. Before the fake castle, there was a real one. Not on the lake island where Franzensburg now stands. That's artificial. Lake created, island constructed, everything theatrical. But on a nearby hill. Actual medieval fortress, built around 1200 by minor Austrian nobles whose names have been lost to incomplete record-keeping. The original castle, historians call it Althof, or simply the Old Castle, was typical small medieval fortification. Stone keep perhaps 15 meters square, defensive walls 2 meters thick, modest living quarters, a hall for gatherings, storage spaces, quarters for garrison of maybe 20 soldiers. Nothing impressive by later Habsburg standards, but genuine, functional, built for actual military purpose. It controlled the area around what's now Laxenburg, approximately 15 kilometers south of Vienna. Strategic location for several reasons. Trade routes from Hungary and Bohemia passed nearby. The Schwechat River provided water and transportation. Forest lands offered hunting, and proximity to Vienna meant any force threatening the city would pass through this territory. The castle changed hands repeatedly through the 13th and 14th centuries. Local noble families, Bishopric of Vienna at one point. Various owners whose histories are fragmentary because medieval record-keeping focused on major events, wars, successions, property disputes involving powerful families. Minor castles held by minor nobles merited little documentation. What we know comes from scattered references. A charter from 1232 mentions fortification at Laxenburg, the old spelling of Laxenburg. Property transfer in 1306 describes stone castle with surrounding lands. Tax records from 1340s list castle and associated village. Fragmentary documentation painting incomplete picture. By 1306, the Habsburgs controlled it. Not through conquest, through purchase and inheritance, the methods they preferred. The family was accumulating territory across Austria, building power base. Laxenburg Castle was minor acquisition among many, but useful. They maintained it, stationed small garrison, collected taxes from surrounding villages, used it occasionally when hunting in nearby forests. The castle itself was architecturally unremarkable. Stone construction typical of period. Defensive features adequate for small fortress. High walls, single defendable gate, corner towers providing overlapping fields of fire. Living quarters basic by noble standards. Cold in winter. Drafty. The comforts minimal. This was military installation, not pleasure palace. What made Laxenburg location special wasn't the castle. It was the hunting. The forests surrounding the settlement were extraordinarily rich with game. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, everything medieval nobles hunted for sport and prestige. The Habsburgs, like all European aristocracy, were passionate hunters. Good hunting grounds were valuable resources. So they established hunting lodge near the old castle. Separate building, more comfortable than fortress, with facilities for processing game, housing hunting parties, storing equipment. Through 14th and 15th centuries, Laxenburg developed as Habsburg recreational retreat. The castle remained military structure, but around it, infrastructure for aristocratic leisure grew. Dr. Friedrich Polleros is an art historian at the University of Vienna whose research focuses on Habsburg architecture, iconography, and the relationship between building projects and dynastic ideology. The medieval castle at Laxenburg was never militarily or politically important in Habsburg strategy. They had dozens of fortresses. Some controlled major trade routes, some guarded borders, some dominated cities. Laxenburg Castle controlled relatively minor territory. Its value was entirely recreational. The Habsburgs needed places to escape Vienna's formality and political pressures. Laxenburg provided that, close enough for easy access, remote enough for privacy, with excellent hunting. The medieval castle was basically backdrop for leisure activities. By 1500, the old castle was showing its age. 3 centuries of use. Minimal maintenance beyond preventing total collapse. The wooden elements, roofs, floors, interior structures, were deteriorating. The stonework remained solid, but needed pointing. Windows needed replacement. The structure was functional, but declining. And changing military technology was making medieval fortifications obsolete. Cannon were transforming warfare. Stone walls that could withstand siege engines crumbled under artillery bombardment. Star forts with angled bastions designed to deflect cannonballs were replacing vertical castle walls. The old castle's defensive architecture was from a different era. The Habsburgs faced decision: invest significant resources in modernizing Laxenburg Castle, or abandon it as military installation and use the site for other purposes. The answer seemed obvious. The castle had no real strategic value. Modernization would be expensive. Better to let it decline gradually while continuing to use the hunting grounds. So, through early 16th century, the castle aged. Still occupied minimally, a few guards, maintenance staff. Still technically functional, but clearly becoming obsolete. Clearly medieval in a world that was moving beyond medieval military architecture. Then came 1529. The Ottomans. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's first siege of Vienna. And everything changed. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding into Europe for decades. Conquered the Balkans. Destroyed the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohat in 1526. Now, Sultan Suleiman marched on Vienna with army estimated at 120,000 men, the largest military force assembled in Europe in living memory. The first siege of Vienna focused on the city itself. Major urban center, Habsburg capital, strategic prize that would open Central Europe to Ottoman conquest. But the Ottoman forces ravaged everything around Vienna. Armies that size needed supplies. Raiding parties swept through surrounding countryside, taking food, livestock, valuables, destroying anything that might aid Vienna's defense. Laxenburg was directly in their path, 15 kilometers south of Vienna. Small castle with minimal garrison. Not worth formal siege, Ottoman commanders had no interest in wasting time on minor fortification, but worth destroying to prevent it aiding Habsburg resistance. The Ottoman forces attacked in September 1529. Exactly how is undocumented. No one at Laxenburg survived to record the event, and Ottoman sources don't mention minor targets. But the result is known. The castle was burned, the garrison killed or captured, the structure gutted. The stone walls remained. Stone doesn't burn. But roofs, floors, wooden interior structures, everything combustible was destroyed. When Habsburg forces reclaimed the area after Ottomans withdrew, The siege of Vienna failed. Suleiman retreated. They found Laxenburg Castle a ruin. Walls standing. Interior gone. Uninhabitable. The Habsburgs surveyed the damage and made pragmatic decision. Rebuilding would be expensive. And for what purpose? Medieval fortifications were obsolete. Better defenses existed elsewhere. The hunting grounds remained valuable, but the castle itself was no longer useful. So they left it. Abandoned the medieval castle. Let it stand as picturesque ruin. The hunting lodge continued operating. New structures were built for gamekeepers and hunters. But the castle remained ruin, deliberately, as romantic atmospheric feature in landscape. This decision proved crucial 3 centuries later, when Emperor Franz II needed escape from Napoleonic catastrophe, when he decided to build fantasy medieval castle. Those 16th century ruins were still there. Picturesque, atmospheric, genuinely medieval. Real fragments from real castle destroyed by real Ottomans. Franz incorporated elements from those ruins into his fake castle. Genuine stones became props in theatrical set. Real medieval glass, salvaged from the ruins or purchased elsewhere, was installed in fake medieval windows. The distinction between authentic artifact and manufactured fantasy was deliberately blurred from the beginning. But in 1529, no one imagined such use. The ruins were just ruins. Through the 16th and 17th centuries they stood, gradually deteriorating further. Weather eroding exposed stonework. Vegetation reclaiming the site. The old castle becoming exactly what Romantic movement would later love. Gothic ruin slowly dissolving back into nature. The site remained Habsburg property. The hunting grounds continued operating successfully. The ruins were occasionally visited by those who appreciated melancholy beauty of decay. Artists sketched them. Poets composed verses about vanished glory. The ruins became aesthetic object rather than practical structure. By 1600, the old castle was definitively ruined. No roofs anywhere. Many walls partially collapsed. Interior completely gone. Even floors had rotted and fallen. But the ruin had character, had atmosphere. Had that quality ruins possess? The suggestion of former glory combined with reminder of mortality, creating peculiar aesthetic appeal. The Habsburgs began appreciating the ruins aesthetically rather than practically, started maintaining them carefully, not repairing or rebuilding, but preventing complete collapse so the picturesque quality could be preserved. Stone walls were stabilized. Dangerous sections were made safe for visitors. The ruin was cultivated as ruin. This was early sign of what would later become full romantic obsession with medieval past. The appreciation of Gothic architecture not for its function, but for its emotional impact. The valuing of ruins specifically because they were ruins, because they evoked feeling of lost greatness, of time's passage, of human achievement's impermanence. By 1700, the old castle was established feature of Laxenburg landscape, picturesque ruin integrated into hunting park, background for imperial leisure activities, aesthetic object that enhanced park's romantic atmosphere. The transformation from functional fortress to decorative folly was complete. But the transformation wasn't finished, not until Napoleon shattered Habsburg confidence so completely that Emperor Franz needed escape desperately enough to build entire fake medieval world, to incorporate the real ruins into manufactured fantasy, to make genuine medieval fragments, foundation for elaborate theatrical production. The ruins waited patiently through the 18th century, while Habsburgs married cousins and damaged their bloodline catastrophically, while their empire grew in territory but weakened genetically, while revolution approached from France, while the old order faced challenges it couldn't comprehend. The medieval past was dead, destroyed by Ottomans in 1529. crumbling slowly for 2 centuries. But its ghost remained at Laxenburg, haunting the hunting park, waiting for emperor desperate enough to resurrect it. Not authentically, that was impossible, but beautifully, falsely, perfectly. The stage was set, the ruins were ready, the props were in place. All that was needed was sufficient catastrophe to drive Habsburg emperor into complete denial of reality, to make fantasy medieval castle psychological necessity rather than architectural whim. That catastrophe was approaching. Born in Corsica, 1769, would rise through French military ranks, would crown himself emperor, would destroy Holy Roman Empire, would conquer most of Europe, would shatter Habsburg world so completely that building fake castle would seem reasonable response. Napoleon Bonaparte, destroyer of old order, creator of modern Europe, and unwitting inspiration for Austria's strangest building project. His time was coming, and with it, Franz II's desperate need to escape into beautiful lies. Chapter 2. The Habsburg Bloodline and the Genetic Catastrophe, 1500 to 1790. The Habsburg dynasty built the greatest empire in Europe through marriage, then destroyed itself through the same strategy. The motto was simple: Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nub. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. While other dynasties spent blood and treasure on battlefields, the Habsburgs acquired territory through strategic marriages. Marry into wealthy families. Inherit their lands. Consolidate through advantageous matches. Build empire through wedding contracts rather than siege warfare. It worked spectacularly well. Through 15th and 16th centuries, Habsburg marriages brought stunning territorial gains. Burgundy acquired through Maximilian I's marriage to Mary of Burgundy. Spain and its vast American empire through marriage to Spanish royal family. The Netherlands. Parts of Italy. Territories across Europe fell to Habsburgs through careful matrimonial strategy. By 1500, the Habsburg Empire was largest since Rome. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 to 1556, ruled territories on which the sun literally never set, from Spain to Austria, from Netherlands to Latin America. The marriage strategy had created unprecedented power. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem that wouldn't become fully apparent for generations. To keep all those territories within Habsburg control required marrying within Habsburg family. The children from Spanish branch married cousins from Austrian branch. Uncles married nieces. The acceptable marriage pool became smaller and smaller. The bloodline became closed loop. And the genetic consequences were devastating. The first visible sign was the jaw. Mandibular prognathism, medical term for condition where lower jaw extends beyond upper jaw. In mild cases, distinctive family trait that became Habsburg trademark. In severe cases, physical deformity that made speech difficult, chewing problematic, breathing sometimes impaired. Each generation, the jaw became more pronounced, more debilitating. In portraits of successive Habsburg rulers, you can track the progression. Early Habsburgs had strong but not deformed jaws. By 17th century, the jaw dominated faces, made individuals instantly recognizable, and increasingly dysfunctional. Charles II of Spain represented the genetic endpoint. Born 1661 to parents who were uncle and niece, his father, Philip IV, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. The genetic concentration was extreme. Charles II received defective genes from both sides of already damaged family tree. His jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew food properly, had to swallow most meals without adequate mastication. He was probably impotent. Married twice. No children from either marriage, despite desperate desire for heir. Mentally disabled, contemporary accounts describe him as having difficulty concentrating, understanding complex issues, physically weak, constantly ill, barely able to walk in his later years. He suffered seizures, possibly epileptic. Charles II died November 1700 at age 38. No heirs. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with him. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, European powers fighting over who would control Spain and its empire now that Habsburgs had bred themselves into extinction in that branch. Dr. Estella Weiss-Kreitzy is a bioarchaeologist at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, whose research includes genetic analysis of Habsburg remains and skeletal evidence of inbreeding effects. The Habsburg breeding program was genetic disaster unfolding across centuries. They had small pool of acceptable marriage partners, European royalty of appropriate rank and religion, and they married within that pool repeatedly, often to close relatives. This concentrates recessive genes, increases probability that harmful genetic variants will manifest. The Habsburgs experienced what animal breeders call inbreeding depression, reduced fitness, increased frequency of abnormalities, decreased fertility, ultimately reduced viability of the lineage. Charles II of Spain was textbook example of severe inbreeding effects. That he survived to age 38 is remarkable. That he produced no heirs was genetic inevitability. But the Austrian Habsburgs didn't learn from Spanish branch's collapse. Continued same marriage strategy. Kept breeding within family. The genetic load kept accumulating. Mental illness appeared with increasing frequency. Depression was common across Habsburg family members. Anxiety disorders. Some historians identify possible schizophrenia in several individuals, though historical diagnoses are uncertain. The genetic burden wasn't just physical deformity. It affected neurological function, psychological stability, mental health, and physical weakness beyond the jaw. Compromised immune systems making family members susceptible to infections that healthier individuals would survive. Respiratory problems, digestive issues. The accumulation of genetic defects manifested in multiple body systems, yet they continued. Through 16th century, through 17th century, into 18th century. The same pattern. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, the family tree becoming family circle. Each generation inherited genetic burden from previous generation and often added to it through continued inbreeding. Emperor Leopold I, ruling 1658 to 1705, embodied the physical manifestation. Pronounced Habsburg jaw visible in all his portraits. Weak constitution, constantly ill, multiple health crises throughout life. But mentally sharp, capable ruler, good administrator. The cognitive functions weren't always affected, just the physical body bearing visible cost of genetic burden. His successors continued the pattern. Emperor Joseph I, 1705 to 1711. Emperor Charles VI, 1711 to 1740. Each generation, the marriages were within family. Each generation, the genetic load increased. The law of probability ensured that eventually, the accumulation of harmful recessive genes would produce more individuals like Charles II of Spain. Maria Theresa, ruling 1740 to 1780, was exception in some ways, physically stronger than many Habsburg relatives, intelligent, capable administrator, politically astute. She bore 16 children, extraordinary fertility suggesting her particular genetic burden was lower than some family members. But she married Francis I Stephen of Lorraine, who was her second cousin, still within family, though more distantly related than some matches. And of those 16 children, several showed problems. Mental disabilities in some cases, physical deformities in others, behavioral issues that suggested psychological problems. Not all. Marie Antoinette was physically normal, just politically doomed. But enough to demonstrate the genetic problems persisted. The medical knowledge of the time couldn't explain what was happening. Genetics wouldn't be understood until Mendel's work in the 1860s, and wouldn't be applied to human heredity until early 20th century. 18th century physicians saw the physical problems, the jaw, the illnesses, the mental disturbances, but couldn't explain them as genetic consequences of inbreeding. Attributed them to God's will, to bad humors, to various medical theories that were completely wrong. But everyone could see something was wrong with Habsburg bloodline. The physical evidence was undeniable. Court physicians documented the health problems. Artists painted the deformed jaws honestly. The family's genetic deterioration was becoming visible even if the mechanism wasn't understood. Emperor Joseph II, Maria Theresa's son, ruling 1780 to 1790, was reformer, Enlightenment thinker, attempted to modernize empire through administrative reforms. But he was also increasingly mentally unstable in his later years. Depression that deepened into despair, paranoia about subordinates, behavioral changes that worried his advisors, the psychological manifestation of genetic burden. He died suddenly in 1790 at age 48, officially from tuberculosis exacerbated by exhaustion from overwork. But the weakened immune system that made him susceptible to TB was likely genetic consequence of inbreeding. His brother Leopold II succeeded, ruled only 2 years, 1790 to 1792. Died at age 44, sudden death that some historians suspect was poison, others think natural causes exacerbated by genetic weakness. The Habsburg bloodline was becoming demonstrably fragile. And then came Franz, Leopold's son, born 1768, would become Emperor Franz II, last Holy Roman Emperor, first Emperor of Austria, builder of Franzensburg, escaper into fantasy. Franz inherited genetic load from both parents, Habsburg jaw, though not as extreme as Spanish branch, physical health issues throughout life, frequent illnesses, weak constitution, and psychological problems that would become more evident under stress, anxiety that sometimes approached panic, paranoid tendencies, seeing conspiracies, distrusting subordinates, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, need for routine, for order, for control over environment, difficulty dealing with change or unpredictability, need for escape when reality became too threatening. All of this can be understood as genetic burden manifesting psychologically. Inbreeding affects brain chemistry, neurological function. The anxiety, the paranoia, the obsessive need for control weren't character flaws. They were medical symptoms of centuries of damaged breeding. Franz married 4 times. Each wife died. First wife, Elisabeth Wilhelmina of Württemberg, distant cousin, died in childbirth 1790 after 2 years of marriage. Second wife, Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, also cousin, died 1807 from complications after childbirth. Third wife, Maria Ludovica of Austria Este, cousin again, died 1816 from tuberculosis, exacerbated by weak constitution. Fourth wife, Caroline Augusta of Bavaria, finally not a close cousin, though still within broader European royal family, survived Franz, but was clearly chosen partially for genetic diversity after 3 wives died. Of Franz's children from these marriages, several died young. Others showed physical or mental problems. The exact details are obscured in official records. Habsburg family controlled documentation, suppressed embarrassing medical information. But pattern is clear from surviving evidence. The dynasty's genetic deterioration was accelerating in Franz's generation. And Franz knew, couldn't explain it genetically. That understanding was still decades away, but could see it physically. His wives dying, his children dying or showing problems, his own anxiety and health issues, The family's increasing fragility was medically obvious even to contemporary observers. And, politically, everything was collapsing too. Revolution in France, 1789. War with revolutionary France, from 1792. Napoleon rising through military ranks, the Holy Roman Empire weakening. Traditional order facing challenges from new ideologies, republicanism, nationalism, liberalism. Habsburg world was being threatened from every direction. Franz's psychological response to this cascade of crises was revealing. Rather than confronting problems directly, fighting harder, reforming more aggressively, adapting to changing circumstances, he retreated. Emotionally, psychologically, eventually physically into fantasy medieval world he would build at Laxenburg. The genetic burden made him vulnerable to stress. The anxiety, the need for control, the difficulty with unpredictable change, these weren't adequate coping mechanisms for revolutionary era. Franz needed escape, needed space he could control completely, needed world that followed his rules and his understanding of how things should be. Franzensburg would become that space. Fantasy medieval castle where Habsburg bloodline wasn't failing, where political power wasn't crumbling, where Franz could play at being medieval emperor in perfect controlled environment, where reality stopped at the bridge and beautiful lies took over. But before he could build that escape, before he could retreat into manufactured medieval fantasy, the catastrophe had to become complete. The world had to fall apart utterly. Napoleon had to destroy everything Franz knew and understood. That was coming. 1792 brought war. 1797 brought defeat. 1804 brought end of Holy Roman Empire. 1809 brought Napoleon's armies occupying Vienna, Franz fleeing to Hungary in humiliation. And through it all, Franz would be planning his escape, his fantasy castle, his beautiful lie where he could pretend none of the disasters were happening, where medieval order was preserved, where Habsburg power still mattered, where genetic deterioration could be hidden behind theatrical facades. The genetic catastrophe and political collapse were accelerating together. The bloodline that built Europe's greatest empire through marriage was dying through that same strategy. The family that concentrated power was concentrating genetic defects. The dynasty was entering terminal decline. Franzensburg would be monument to that decline, not celebrating it, denying it, hiding from it, escaping into fantasy where none of it existed. The beautiful lie built precisely when truth became unbearable. The emperor who would build it was born. The genetic burden was accumulating. The political disasters were approaching. All that remained was waiting for catastrophe sufficient to justify complete retreat from reality. Napoleon was coming, and Franz was already planning where to hide. Chapter 3. The Napoleonic Catastrophe and the Emperor's Psychological Collapse, 1792 to 1806. April 20th, 1792. Revolutionary France declares war on Austria. The French government claims this is defensive. Austria threatens revolutionary government, supports counter-revolutionaries, conspires to restore French monarchy. The reality is more complex. Both sides want war for their own reasons. France wants to spread revolutionary ideology and distract from internal problems by uniting population against external enemy. Austria wants to crush revolution before it spreads revolutionary ideas and inspires unrest in Austrian territories. Emperor Franz II, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in July 1792 after his father Leopold's sudden death in March, leads Austrian response. He's 24 years old, inexperienced in warfare and diplomacy, unprepared psychologically for what's approaching. His anxiety and need for control are already evident to court observers. War will exacerbate these tendencies catastrophically. The first coalition forms quickly. Austria, Prussia, Spain, Britain, various smaller German and Italian states allied against revolutionary France. The coalition has apparent advantages: larger combined armies, better training, more resources, experienced commanders. France is in chaos: internal conflict between revolutionary factions, economic crisis, military disorganization as aristocratic officer corps emigrates or is purged. Should be relatively easy victory. Instead, France wins, repeatedly, confoundingly. The revolutionary armies prove highly motivated, fighting for ideological principles, not just dynastic interests. The levée en masse, mass conscription declared August 1793, creates armies of unprecedented size. And French commanders innovate tactically, develop new formations, use artillery more effectively, move armies faster than traditional European forces expect. By 1797, Austria is forced to sue for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed October 1797, costs Austria the Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, and various Italian territories. France gains major strategic positions. Austria receives Republic of Venice as compensation. But this is minor consolation. The clear message: revolutionary France has defeated combined might of European monarchies. For Franz, this is crushing psychological blow. His first major test as emperor, and he failed. The Holy Roman Empire, which he nominally leads as emperor, is shown to be powerless. France treats with individual German states directly, ignoring imperial authority. The empire's weakness is exposed to all Europe. But worse is approaching, because leading French armies in Italy is young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's just getting started. Napoleon becomes first consul in November 1799 after coup d'état. Effectively dictator of France, he consolidates power rapidly, reorganizes French administration, builds efficient military machine, prepares for European domination. War resumes in 1800. Second coalition: Austria, Britain, Russia against France. Same pattern as before. Coalition appears stronger on paper. Napoleon destroys them anyway. Battle of Marengo in Italy, June 1800. Decisive French victory. Battle of Hohenlinden in Bavaria, December 1800. Crushing Austrian defeat. Peace treaty signed February 1801 at Lunéville. Austria loses more territory, more humiliation. Franz's confidence is shattered. Every major European war in his reign has ended in defeat. The empire is shrinking, Austrian influence diminishing, Habsburg power visibly declining. And it's precisely during this catastrophe that Franz begins planning Franzensburg. The year is 1801, same year as Lunéville Peace Treaty, same year Napoleon consolidates power, same year Austrian defeat becomes undeniable. Franz commissions court architect Franz Jäger to design fantasy medieval castle on artificial island in Laxenburg Lake. Not defensive fortress, not practical administrative building, fantasy recreation of idealized medieval world. Escape from unbearable present into imagined past where everything made sense, power structures were stable. Habsburg authority was unquestioned. Dr. Polaros describes Franz's psychological state during this period. Franz was experiencing multiple catastrophic stressors simultaneously. Military defeat, his armies consistently losing to France. Political humiliation, treated as second-rate power by Napoleon. Personal loss, wives dying, children dying. Genetic burden manifesting as psychological fragility. Anxiety, paranoia, obsessive need for control. The medieval castle project was coping mechanism, creating completely controllable space when everything else was chaos. Building perfect past when present was unbearable failure. The castle design develops through 1801 to 1803. Franz is deeply personally involved, reviews every architectural detail, obsesses over authenticity while simultaneously accepting completely fake construction. This contradiction is revealing. He wants feeling of medieval, emotional experience of authentic past, but doesn't require actual authenticity. Wants convincing fantasy, not historical accuracy. Meanwhile, Napoleon's ambitions expand. In May 1804, he crowns himself Emperor of France, not elected, not hereditary succession. Self-proclaimed emperor, creates French Empire through personal charisma and military force. The symbolism is devastating for Franz. Napoleon, commoner from Corsica, product of revolution, military adventurer, claiming imperial title, making mockery of hereditary monarchy's legitimacy, demonstrating that empires can be created through force rather than inherited through divine right. Franz responds by transforming his own title. August 1804. Proclaims himself Emperor of Austria, Franz I. This is defensive maneuver. The Holy Roman Empire is clearly dying. Napoleon's reorganization of German states into Confederation of the Rhine is destroying traditional imperial structure. Franz needs imperial title that doesn't depend on Holy Roman Empire. Creates Austrian Empire as successor state, hedging against inevitable collapse. But this makes him simultaneously Franz II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Franz I, Emperor of Austria. The dual numbering reveals the transition, the old order dying, new order being born. Franz caught between them. 2 years later, the final blow comes. Summer 1806. After Napoleon defeats Third Coalition at Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805, perhaps the most perfect military victory in European history, Napoleon crushing combined Austrian and Russian armies through brilliant tactical maneuver. After complete humiliation of Habsburg military power, Napoleon demands Franz dissolve Holy Roman Empire. Just abolish it. End thousand-year institution. Admit its meaningless fiction. Stop pretending the empire exists. Franz complies. August 6, 1806. Formal abdication as Holy Roman Emperor. The empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800, led by Habsburgs since 1438, ends. Franz II ceases to exist. Only Franz I, Emperor of Austria, remains. The psychological impact is devastating. Franz is last Holy Roman Emperor. The dynasty that built European power structure for centuries just participated in destroying it. He personally dissolved the empire, admitted its death, acknowledged defeat. And Franzensburg is under construction during this entire catastrophe. The fantasy medieval castle rising on artificial island. Perfect timing. As real empire collapses, fake castle appears. As political authority dissolves into Napoleonic reorganization, romantic delusion manifests in stone and plaster. As centuries of Habsburg power evaporate, beautiful lie takes physical form. Construction accelerates 1806 to 1808. Franz visits Laxenburg constantly, escapes Vienna's humiliations to watch his fantasy develop, supervises personally, changes details obsessively. The castle becomes his project, his creation, his controlled space in world spinning beyond his control. The castle incorporates elements from genuine medieval ruins at Laxenburg, real stones from fortress destroyed by Ottomans in 1529, ancient stained glass allegedly from monasteries Napoleon's armies dissolved across Europe, fragments of actual history embedded in fake architecture. The distinction between authentic artifact and theatrical prop deliberately blurred from the beginning. This is psychologically revealing. Franz can't fully commit to pure fantasy. Needs connection to real medieval past. Needs genuine artifacts to anchor the illusion. needs proof that medieval world actually existed, even as he builds completely fake version of it. The authentic and fake intertwine deliberately. Real medieval glass in theatrical windows, genuine stones in manufactured walls, ancient fragments in modern structure. Everything designed to feel authentic while being completely fabricated. The whole castle embodies Franz's relationship with reality, unable to face it directly, unable to completely abandon it, creating hybrid space where truth and lies coexist in deliberately confused state. By 1809, Franzensburg is largely complete. The basic structure finished. Towers rising, bridge spanning moat, interior spaces furnished with mixture of genuine medieval artifacts and skillful reproductions. Perfect escape ready. Perfect denial available. Perfect refuge from unbearable reality prepared. And Franz needs it desperately, because 1809 brings another catastrophe. Fifth Coalition War. Austria tries once more to defeat Napoleon, fails once more. Battle of Wagram, July 1809. Another crushing Austrian defeat. Napoleon's forces occupy Vienna. Franz flees to Hungary. The humiliation is total and public. The subsequent peace treaty, Treaty of Schönbrunn, October 1809, costs Austria massive additional territory. Coastal access to Adriatic Sea lost. Millions of subjects transferred to French control or newly created states. War indemnity of 85 million francs, enormous sum that bankrupts Austrian state finances for years. The empire is prostrate, defeated, humiliated, reduced to second-rate power. Franz returns to Vienna in defeat. The proud Habsburg emperor is reduced to Napoleon's client. The ancient dynasty has been humbled by Corsican upstart. Everything Franz was raised to believe about Habsburg superiority and divine right has been destroyed by military reality. But Franzensburg is ready. The fantasy castle is complete. Franz can retreat there, leave Vienna's political humiliations, cross bridge to island, enter medieval world where Habsburgs still matter, where nobility still means something, where traditional order is preserved perfectly, where he can play emperor in completely controlled environment and pretend modern world with Napoleon and revolution and defeat doesn't exist. The castle becomes Franz's psychological refuge through remaining years of Napoleonic dominance. He withdraws there frequently, hosts small select gatherings, shows visitors his collection of medieval artifacts, real and fake, mixed indistinguishably, dresses in period-appropriate clothing, holds banquets in Knight's Hall, lives in fantasy world where he's successful emperor of powerful realm. Reality continues outside the island. Napoleon dominates Europe. Revolutionary ideas spread despite monarchist resistance. Habsburg power continues declining. The dynasty's genetic problems continue worsening. Franz's children show increasing evidence of inbreeding effects. But inside Franzensburg, none of that exists. Inside the fake medieval castle, Franz can believe, can pretend, can escape. The beautiful lie becomes more real to him than ugly truth outside. The catastrophe drove him there. Napoleon's conquest made it necessary. The collapse of everything he knew made fantasy essential. The beautiful lie became psychological survival mechanism, architectural expression of denial, monument to aristocratic escape from unbearable modernity. Franzensburg stands on its island. Perfect, medieval, completely fake, completely necessary for Franz's mental stability. The emperor's escape from empire's collapse. The dynasty's denial made architectural. The beautiful lie built while reality burned. And it would outlast everything. Napoleon would fall eventually. Holy Roman Empire stayed dead. But Franzensburg would remain. the fake castle proving more permanent than real empire. The lie outlasting the truth, it was built to escape. Chapter 4. The Theatrical Castle and the Question of Authenticity, 1801 to 1835. Franzensburg is theater, literally, architectural theater, a building designed to perform medieval castle, convincingly enough that visitors suspend disbelief and accept the illusion. The construction reveals this theatrical nature fundamentally. The castle isn't built from stone blocks, it's brick covered in plaster. The plaster is painted and textured to look like weathered stone. Different sections are given different ages. Some areas made to appear 13th century, others 15th century, according to the theatrical narrative Franz creates. The weathering is applied deliberately by artisans. The age is manufactured by craftsmen who specialize in creating artificial patina. The entire structure is stage set writ impossibly large, but it's expensive stage set. Franz spent approximately 100,000 florins on Franzensburg, equivalent to several million euros in modern purchasing power, for a fake castle. During period of severe financial crisis caused by Napoleonic wars, while the Austrian state was bankrupt from war indemnities, while the economy struggled under military expenses, the priorities are psychologically revealing. The architect, Franz Jäger, was scenographer as much as traditional architect. His professional background was court theater, designing sets for imperial performances, creating temporary structures for festivals and celebrations, understanding how to create convincing visual illusion, how to make plaster look like stone, how to manufacture appearance of age, how to design spaces for emotional impact rather than practical function. Franzensburg applies those theatrical techniques to permanent architecture. The result is building that looks medieval, but functions as 19th century fantasy. That appears ancient, but contains modern conveniences. That performs castle, while being elaborate folly. The castle's layout is deliberately picturesque rather than practical. Not designed for actual defensive purposes, the walls couldn't withstand cannon fire. Not arranged for efficient habitation, the room layouts are awkward, spaces don't flow logically, but perfect for creating romantic tableau. Tower positioned here because it looks beautiful reflected in lake water. Wall placed there because it frames view of forest correctly. Bridge positioned for maximum theatrical impact as visitors approach, not for defensive utility. Dr. Michaela Kronberger is an architectural historian at the Technical University of Vienna, whose research specializes in 19th century historicist architecture and the deliberate recreation of past architectural styles for ideological purposes. Franzensburg represents early historicism, the deliberate recreation of past architectural styles, not for restoration of existing buildings, but for creation of entirely new structures designed to evoke historical periods for emotional and ideological purposes. This wasn't restoration work, because there was nothing to restore at this site. The medieval ruins were elsewhere. This was pure creation of new building designed to feel medieval. It's fake, but sophisticatedly fake. The craftsmanship is genuinely excellent even though the premise is deliberately false. The building succeeds as theater, even though it fails as authentic historical architecture. The interior continues the theatrical approach. Rooms designed as sets for specific purposes. The Knight's Hall displays armor arranged dramatically on walls, some pieces genuinely medieval, purchased from collectors or salvaged from dissolved monasteries. Others are reproductions created specifically for display, manufactured to look old. Visitors aren't told which is which. The chapel contains medieval stained glass, some documented as coming from specific churches, others appearing in no records before being installed at Franzensburg. Provenance unclear. The treasury houses religious relics, bone fragments supposedly from saints, authenticated by questionable documentation that Franz accepted without rigorous verification. Everything is curated for emotional impact rather than historical accuracy. The armor is arranged to look impressive, not to demonstrate actual historical development of military equipment. The stained glass is positioned to catch light beautifully, creating atmospheric effects, not to illustrate specific religious narratives or historical periods. The relics are displayed with theatrical reverence in ornate reliquaries, creating sense of sacredness and ancient piety, not to provide educational context about medieval religious practices. The space is designed to overwhelm visitors, to inspire awe, to make them forget they're in a fake castle built in 1801 and believe they've entered genuine medieval world. The theatrical techniques are sophisticated and largely successful. Many contemporary visitors did believe they were seeing authentic medieval architecture and artifacts. Franz personally selected and arranged everything. He was obsessively involved in every detail, visited the construction site constantly, adjusted placements repeatedly, changed his mind about arrangements. The castle was his creation in very personal sense, his fantasy, his controlled environment, his world where he made all decisions and everything followed his vision. The medieval elements incorporated from actual Laxenburg ruins are used selectively and strategically. Genuine stones from the Ottoman-destroyed fortress are placed prominently in locations where visitors will notice them and assume everything is equally authentic. Real medieval stained glass is installed in main windows where it's visible and impressive. Authentic architectural fragments are positioned in entrance areas where they establish credibility for entire structure. Then reproductions and modern construction fill remaining spaces. The technique is sophisticated deception. Use enough genuine elements to create impression of authenticity, then extend that impression through skillful fakes. The visitor assumes that if some elements are genuine medieval, everything must be. The mixing is deliberate strategy to blur distinction between real and fake. The distinction between authentic and reproduction is never acknowledged in Franz's presentations. There are no labels saying reproduction created 1805 or modern recreation in medieval style. Everything is presented as equally authentic. The genuine 15th century glass is displayed beside newly created glass, aged to look 15th century, with no indication which is which. The armor includes both genuine medieval pieces and modern reproductions mixed together on the same walls. The deception is comprehensive and deliberate. Franz wants visitors to believe everything is authentic, needs them to believe. Because if they recognize it's theatrical, the fantasy collapses. The escape only works if the illusion is maintained absolutely. This extends to documentation and narrative. Franz commissioned histories of Franzensburg, fictional accounts of medieval nobles who supposedly lived in castle on this site, invented genealogies connecting the fake castle to real Habsburg history, romantic stories about knights and ladies and tournaments and medieval life. The fantasy extended beyond architecture into narrative, creating complete fictional past for building that had no actual past. Some contemporary observers recognized the deception immediately, criticized it, called Franzensburg theatrical, artificial, inappropriate, complained that emperor was wasting money on elaborate play acting while empire faced real crises. The criticisms were valid, but Franz didn't care, wasn't building for critics, was building for himself, for his psychological needs, for his requirement to escape into controllable fantasy when reality was unbearable chaos. The fake armor is a particularly revealing element. The collection includes some genuinely medieval pieces, purchased from collectors, acquired when monasteries were dissolved, inherited from old Habsburg holdings. These are displayed with pride as authentic artifacts connecting Franzensburg to real medieval past. But other pieces are reproductions, created specifically for Franzensburg by armorers working in early 19th century, made to look old through artificial aging techniques, chemical treatments to rust metal appropriately, mechanical processes to create wear patterns, artistic skill to replicate medieval construction methods convincingly. Then displayed beside genuine pieces without any distinction. Why mix real and fake? Because Franz needed both. The genuine artifacts authenticated the fantasy. They proved medieval world actually existed, provided tangible connection to real past. The reproductions filled gaps, created comprehensive displays impossible with only genuine pieces, which were rare and expensive. Together, they produced convincing illusion of complete medieval armory. The chapel demonstrates this mixing perfectly. The altar contains relics, bone fragments supposedly from various saints. Are they genuine? Contemporary church documentation is ambiguous at best. The provenance is unclear. Where did these bones come from? Who authenticated them as saintly relics? The verification is circular. They're real because they're at Franzensburg, and Franzensburg only displays real relics. Therefore, they must be real. The medieval stained glass in chapel windows is similarly ambiguous. Some pieces are documented as coming from specific monasteries dissolved during Napoleonic era, when religious institutions were closed and their properties confiscated. These dissolutions created market for ecclesiastical art. Stained glass, sculptures, altar pieces, religious objects all became available for purchase. Franz bought extensively from this market. But other glass panels appear in no records before appearing at Franzensburg. No documentation of origin, no provenance trail, no authentication. Did Franz purchase them from undocumented sources? Were they created in early 19th century to look medieval? The evidence is insufficient to determine with certainty. Modern scientific analysis helps somewhat. Chemical composition of glass can suggest manufacturing period. Construction techniques can be dated. Weathering patterns can indicate age. Some Franzensburg glass tests as genuinely medieval when analyzed scientifically. Other panels test as early 19th century production, created during or shortly before castle's construction period. But even scientific testing isn't definitive. Medieval glass-making techniques were well understood by 1800s craftsmen. Skilled artisans could replicate them convincingly. Chemical compositions could be matched closely. The tests can sometimes distinguish genuine medieval from modern fake, but not always reliably enough to authenticate every piece with certainty. The fundamental problem is that Franz deliberately cultivated ambiguity. Didn't want clear distinction between real and fake. Wanted visitors to wonder, to believe, to accept the entire environment as authentic without demanding proof. The mixing was intentional strategy, not accidental oversight. The construction techniques reveal the fake nature undeniably. The walls are brick covered in plaster, not solid stone. The stone texture is painted on. The weathering is applied artificially. Medieval masons didn't work this way. The construction is demonstrably 19th century using theatrical techniques to simulate medieval appearance. But the castle also incorporates genuine medieval structural elements where possible. Real stones from Laxenburg ruins are built into walls in some sections. Authentic carved elements are installed as decorative features. The mixing of modern construction and genuine medieval fragments continues even at structural level. And the castle includes modern conveniences hidden behind medieval facades. Gas lighting was installed behind torch fixtures. Visitors saw medieval torches, but they were lit by modern gas. Heating systems were concealed in walls. The medieval appearance was maintained while modern comfort was provided. Iron supports were hidden behind wooden facades. Structural requirements of tall towers were met with modern engineering disguised as medieval carpentry. The castle is simultaneously medieval and modern. Looks ancient, functions contemporary, provides 19th century comfort in 13th century aesthetic package. The contradiction is never acknowledged to visitors. The illusion is maintained absolutely. Franz hosted gatherings at Franzensburg regularly, small groups of trusted courtiers, fellow nobles who shared his romantic medievalism. They dressed in period costumes, played at being knights and ladies, held banquets in Knights' Hall with period-appropriate or period-theatrical food and entertainment. The fantasy was performed actively, not just viewed passively. These gatherings were genuinely therapeutic for Franz psychologically, allowed him to play emperor in completely controlled environment, where everyone followed agreed-upon script, where medieval hierarchy was respected perfectly, where his authority was absolute because it was theatrical performance and he was director, lead actor, and audience simultaneously. The contrast with real Vienna was stark and deliberate. In the city, Franz faced political opposition, constitutional pressures from growing liberal movements, economic crises requiring complex decisions, military weakness requiring difficult choices. Reality constantly intruded with problems requiring real solutions. But at Franzensburg, reality stopped at the bridge. The island was his kingdom, fake kingdom, but entirely his. He controlled every aspect, could change anything he disliked, could maintain the fantasy perfectly, could escape from unbearable complexities of modern governance into simple, theatrical certainties of medieval hierarchy. The architecture supported this psychological function perfectly. The isolation of artificial island, the controlled access across single bridge, the walls creating literal barrier between inside, fantasy, and outside, reality. You crossed from modern world into medieval one, from real empire into fantasy, from unbearable truth into beautiful lie. By 1820, Franzensburg was fully established, complete structurally, furnished comprehensively, populated with mixture of genuine medieval artifacts and skillful reproductions. Franz's refuge was ready. His escape was built. His denial was architectural. He spent increasing time there through 1820s and early 1830s. Vienna depressed him, political pressures, economic problems, reminders of military defeats and lost territories. But Franzensburg offered alternative. Fantasy world where Habsburgs still mattered in uncomplicated ways, where nobility meant something clear and simple, where medieval order was preserved absolutely. The castle even aged deliberately under Franz's direction. He had craftsmen apply additional artificial weathering periodically, make newer sections look older, create increasing patina, age the stage set to increase verisimilitude. The deception extended to manufacturing the appearance of time's passage itself. And it worked. Visitors believed. Nobles who visited praised the castle's medieval authenticity, commented on how remarkably well preserved it was, didn't recognize they were seeing brand-new construction disguised as centuries-old architecture. The theatrical techniques succeeded. The lie convinced. Franz died March 2, 1835 at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, not at Franzensburg. But the castle was central to his final years, his refuge, his escape, his beautiful lie that made unbearable reality tolerable. The castle passed to his successors. They maintained it carefully, respected the fantasy Franz created, continued using it as retreat from Vienna's political pressures. The beautiful lie outlived its creator and continued functioning exactly as designed. Franzensburg stands today on its island, still performing medieval castle for tourists, still mixing genuine artifacts with skillful fakes, still representing Habsburg psychology, the need to escape, the denial of decline, the retreat into fantasy when reality becomes unbearable. The stage set endured. The theater continued. The beautiful lie became permanent architectural feature. The fake castle proved more lasting than many genuine medieval fortresses. The carefully constructed fantasy outlasted the empire it was built to escape from. And visitors still struggle to distinguish real from fake. Genuine medieval fragments from 19th century reproductions. The ambiguity Franz deliberately created persists. His theatrical masterpiece still performs convincingly. 2 centuries later, the beautiful lie still works. Chapter 5. Ferdinand and the Genetic Collapse Made Visible, 1835 to 1848. Emperor Franz I of Austria died March 2, 1835. His son Ferdinand inherited the throne, and the Habsburg dynasty's genetic catastrophe became impossible to ignore or conceal. Ferdinand I, officially Ferdinand the Benign, though people used that title to avoid saying Ferdinand the Disabled, or worse, embodied every terrible consequence of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding in one tragically damaged individual. Epileptic, suffering from seizures that could strike at any moment, causing convulsions, loss of consciousness, sometimes injuries when he fell. Contemporary medical records document the frequency and severity. Multiple seizures monthly, some requiring days of recovery. Hydrocephalic. Water on the brain. Abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in brain cavities, causing enlarged head, neurological problems, cognitive difficulties. His skull was visibly deformed. The condition likely caused or contributed to his other neurological issues. Mentally disabled, unable to understand complex political issues, struggled with abstract concepts, had difficulty concentrating for extended periods. Contemporary accounts describe him as having mind of a child, though this is probably unfair oversimplification. But he clearly lacked cognitive capacity for independent rule. Subject to severe seizures. Beyond epilepsy, he experienced other neurological episodes, sudden behavioral changes, periods of confusion, episodes of apparent detachment from reality. The exact modern diagnoses are uncertain, but the general picture is of severe neurological impairment. Possibly infertile or impotent, he married twice. First wife Maria Anna of Savoy died childless 1844. Second marriage remained childless until his abdication. Whether this was impotence, infertility, or unconsummated marriages is uncertain from historical records, but no heirs resulted despite desperate dynastic need. Physically weak beyond neurological problems. Susceptible to infections. Poor immune response. The general constitutional weakness that inbreeding produces. He was frequently ill with various ailments throughout his life. The cause of this catastrophic combination of problems was genetics. Ferdinand's parents were double first cousins. His father, Franz I, married Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, and they shared both sets of grandparents through two different ancestral pathways. The genetic relatedness was equivalent to parents who were siblings. The probability of recessive genetic disorders manifesting was extraordinarily high. Ferdinand inherited damaged genes from every direction, received no healthy genetic variants to compensate for harmful ones. The inbreeding was so extreme that his birth with any viability at all was remarkable. That he survived to adulthood and lived to age 75 was medically surprising. That he became emperor at all reveals dynasty's desperation. The Habsburg bloodline was so damaged that Ferdinand was genuinely the best available candidate. The alternatives were equally affected by inbreeding, lived in distant branches of family, or were politically unacceptable for other reasons. Ferdinand was legitimate heir. His disabilities were known. He became emperor anyway because there was no better option. His coronation was revealing. He could barely complete the ceremony, struggled with the physical demands, standing for extended periods, performing ritual actions. The crown was too heavy for him, had to be stabilized by courtiers. The image of disabled emperor being physically supported through coronation ritual communicated Habsburg decline more effectively than any political analysis. Ferdinand's reign was essentially regency from beginning. He never actually governed. Chancellor Clemens von Metternich and a council of advisers made all real decisions. Ferdinand attended ceremonies, signed documents that others prepared for him, provided visible symbol of monarchy. But he decided nothing, understood little, governed not at all. The emperor was decorative function, not political reality. The public knew. Ferdinand's disabilities were too visible to hide. His seizures were public events, happened during ceremonies, official functions, even just moving through palace. His cognitive limitations were obvious in his rare public statements. His physical appearance revealed the hydrocephalus. The genetic failure was on display for everyone to see. But nobody discussed it openly. Not publicly. Not in official contexts. The fiction was maintained obsessively. Ferdinand is emperor. Therefore, Ferdinand is capable. Therefore, the Habsburg bloodline is fine. Therefore, the dynasty is healthy. Everyone knew this was false. The lie was maintained anyway, because admitting the truth meant acknowledging that Habsburg breeding strategy had produced genetic disaster, that the dynasty was failing biologically, that centuries of cousin marriage had created this damaged individual. The admission was too devastating for official acknowledgement. Dr. Weiss-Kreitzy explains the medical reality underlying Ferdinand's conditions. Ferdinand's multiple problems, epilepsy, hydrocephalus, intellectual disability, physical weakness, were consequences of extreme inbreeding. His parents' genetic relatedness was equivalent to brother-sister incest. The probability of recessive genetic disorders expressing was enormous. Ferdinand represents what happens when you concentrate harmful genetic variants through many generations of relative marriage, then produce child from essentially incestuous union. The Habsburg bloodline had accumulated so many harmful recessive genes that Ferdinand's existence demonstrated the breeding strategy's complete failure. Meanwhile, revolution was approaching across Europe. 1848 would bring uprisings in France, Germany, Italy, Austria. The old aristocratic order would face challenge from liberal and nationalist movements, and the Habsburgs would face this existential crisis with an emperor barely capable of understanding what was happening. Franzensburg became more important during Ferdinand's reign. Not to him personally. He barely understood the castle, couldn't appreciate its historical fantasy, lacked the cognitive capacity to engage with Franz's elaborate medieval role-playing. But to the Habsburg family collectively, the castle represented what they desperately wanted to believe about themselves. Noble, connected to glorious medieval past. Legitimate rulers by ancient right. The fantasy became psychologically necessary as the reality. Genetic collapse, political crisis, threatened revolution, became undeniable. The beautiful lie mattered more than ever precisely because the ugly truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The 1848 revolution's forced crisis. February. Paris Revolution overthrows French monarchy. March. Revolutions spread to Vienna, multiple German states, Italian regions. Nationalist and liberal movements demand constitutional government, civil liberties, end to aristocratic privilege. The old order faces coordinated challenge across Europe. Ferdinand couldn't handle this. Literally, couldn't understand the complexity. Couldn't make decisions under pressure. Couldn't even pretend to govern during crisis. His disabilities made him completely incapable of responding to revolution. So in December 1848, Ferdinand was forced to abdicate. Not officially because of his disabilities. That would require admitting genetic catastrophe. Officially for health reasons, allowing him to rest after the strains of revolutionary year. The euphemisms were transparent. Everyone understood. The disabled emperor was being removed because crisis required capable ruler. His nephew, Franz Joseph, became emperor at age 18. The Habsburgs hoped fresh leadership might stabilize situation. Franz Joseph would rule until 1916, 68 years, the longest reigning Habsburg emperor. He would witness continued dynasty decline despite his capability. Because the problems were systemic, genetic, political, structural, not fixable through competent individual leadership. Ferdinand lived until 1875, surviving in quiet obscurity at Prague Castle. Never politically important after abdication. Never missed as emperor. He was tragic figure, victim of his ancestry's terrible choices, damaged by genetics he didn't choose, made emperor despite disabilities he couldn't overcome, then discarded when those disabilities became politically untenable. His existence was Habsburg genetic collapse made visible. Walking proof that the breeding strategy had failed catastrophically. Living evidence that dynasty was dying biologically even while trying to maintain political power. The emperor who couldn't be emperor because inbreeding had damaged him too severely. And Franzensburg stood on its island throughout this. The fantasy medieval castle maintained carefully, while real emperor was genetically catastrophic. The beautiful lie preserved while ugly truth walked through palace halls having seizures. The architectural escape offered, while genetic disaster governed formally. The contradiction was perfect. The dynasty that retreated into fake medieval castle to escape reality was led by emperor whose very existence proved that reality was worse than any fantasy acknowledged. Ferdinand was what the Habsburgs couldn't afford to look at directly. Franzensburg was where they looked instead. The genetic catastrophe and the architectural fantasy coexisted. One biological reality, one psychological denial. Both products of same dynastic strategy, concentrate power through concentrated bloodline, escape unbearable truth through elaborate lies. Both essential to understanding Habsburg decline. Ferdinand's disabilities were medical fact. Franzensburg's beauty was theatrical fake. Together they revealed Habsburg truth. The dynasty was dying, pretending it wasn't, and building elaborate fantasies to make the pretending sustainable. The emperor and the castle. The genetic collapse and the architectural escape. The visible proof of failure and the beautiful lie denying it. Both necessary, both true, both defining Habsburg endstage. Chapter 6. The Long Descent, 1848 to 1918. Franz Joseph became emperor December 2, 1848, at age 18. He would rule 68 years until his death, November 21, 1916. The longest reigning Habsburg emperor. And he would witness everything collapse anyway, despite his capability and dedication. He was functional, unlike his uncle Ferdinand, mentally capable, physically healthy, hard-working to point of obsessive. But competence couldn't save dynasty facing systemic problems. Genetic deterioration, political obsolescence, nationalist movements, industrialization's disruption. These required more than capable emperor. Required fundamental transformation Habsburgs couldn't achieve. Franz Joseph married his cousin Elizabeth of Bavaria, Sisi, in 1854. The marriage was celebrated as romantic love match. Reality was more complex and ultimately tragic. Sisi was beautiful, charismatic, intelligent, also deeply troubled. Developed what modern psychiatry would diagnose as severe eating disorders. Anorexia, bulimia, obsessive exercise, became fixated on maintaining beauty and youth. Traveled constantly to escape Vienna's court formality. Was almost never actually present as empress. Their children suffered predictably from continued inbreeding. Son Rudolf, heir to throne, showed increasingly erratic behavior through his 20s. Depression, alcohol problems, conflict with his father over politics. January 30th, 1889, at Mayerling Hunting Lodge, Rudolf shot and killed his mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, then shot himself. Murder-suicide. The official explanations were contradictory and clearly covering something. The scandal was enormous. The dynasty's future died with him. The exact circumstances remain mysterious. Was it suicide pact? Was Rudolf's mental state so deteriorated he killed impulsively? Were political factors involved? The evidence was suppressed, witnesses silenced, truth concealed. But result was clear. Habsburg heir was dead at 30 by his own hand. The genetic and psychological burden had destroyed another generation. Daughter Gisela showed health problems throughout life. Nervous disorders, depression. The genetic burden persisted even when not as dramatically visible as Ferdinand's disabilities. The damage was there, manifesting in various ways across family members. Franz Joseph himself worked obsessively. Woke at 4 a.m., worked until evening, handled enormous amounts of paperwork personally, micromanaged empire's administration. This level of focus suggests anxiety, need to control everything because trusting others was psychologically difficult. The behavior pattern is consistent with someone carrying genetic burden that manifested as anxiety rather than more severe disabilities. Franzensburg remained family property throughout Franz Joseph's reign. He visited occasionally, appreciated the escape it offered from Vienna's pressures, used it for small private gatherings. But he was less invested in the fantasy than Franz I had been, less psychologically dependent on elaborate medieval role-playing. The castle was pleasant retreat, not essential psychological survival mechanism. But the empire kept weakening. Lost wars, lost territories, lost prestige. 1859. War with France and Piedmont resulted in losing Italian territories. 1866. Austro-Prussian War. Catastrophic defeat. Exclusion from German unification process. The military weakness was chronic and humiliating. Economic modernization was happening slowly and incompletely. Industrialization lagged behind Western Europe. Infrastructure developed unevenly. The empire's economic power was declining relative to emerging industrial nations. Habsburgs were being left behind by modernity. Nationalist movements threatened empire's multi-ethnic structure. Hungarians demanded autonomy, achieved through compromise of 1867, creating dual Austro-Hungarian monarchy. But Czechs, Poles, Italians, Southern Slavs also wanted independence, or at least autonomy. The empire was fragmenting politically even while maintaining formal unity. The bloodline continued deteriorating despite occasional infusions of less related genetics. Franz Joseph's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, became heir after Rudolf's death. Franz Ferdinand married Sophie Chotek. Crucially, she wasn't royalty, making marriage morganatic. Children couldn't inherit throne. But this also meant fresh genetic material. Franz Ferdinand's children would have been genetically healthier than most Habsburgs, but that didn't matter because the marriage rules excluded them from succession. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. The assassination triggered World War I through alliance system. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany supported Austria. France supported Russia. Britain joined. The whole structure collapsed into total war. Austria-Hungary entered World War I as weakest major power. Army was outdated. Multiple ethnic groups had questionable loyalty. Industrial capacity was insufficient. Economy couldn't sustain long war. The empire was unready for modern industrial warfare. Franz Joseph died November 21, 1916, still emperor, still working daily despite being 86 years old. He hadn't lived to see final defeat, but he knew empire was losing. knew the dynasty was ending, spent last years presiding over accelerating collapse. His grandnephew Karl I inherited catastrophe, ruled November 1916 to November 1918. 2 years. Tried desperately to make peace. Failed. Tried to save monarchy through last-minute reforms. Failed. Tried to prevent complete collapse. Failed utterly. The empire lost World War I decisively. By autumn 1918, military collapse was complete. Ethnic regions declared independence. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, formed from Habsburg territories. Poland reformed. Hungary separated. The empire fragmented into successor states. November 11, 1918, Karl renounced participation in Austrian government. Didn't formally abdicate. That would mean acknowledging republic's legitimacy. But ceased functioning as emperor. The monarchy ended. Not through revolution or coup, but through dissolution. The empire simply stopped existing as unified entity. Karl and his family left Austria. Exile. The dynasty that ruled European territories for 7 centuries was banned from returning to their former lands. Property was confiscated. Titles became meaningless. The collapse was total and permanent. Franzensburg became Austrian state property. The new republic owned it, maintained it as historical monument, opened it to tourists. The fake medieval castle survived the real empire's fall. The beautiful lie outlasted everything true. The irony is perfect and complete. The dynasty that built the castle as escape from reality was destroyed by reality. The empire that retreated into medieval fantasy was demolished by modern warfare. The family that denied their genetic collapse died out politically, even while scattered members continued biologically. But the fake castle remained, still on its island, still performing medieval, still mixing real artifacts with skillful reproductions, still representing Habsburg psychology even though Habsburgs no longer ruled anything. The fantasy survived the empire. The theatrical set outlasted the dynasty. The beautiful lie proved more permanent than political reality. Franzensburg won by simply continuing to exist, while everything it represented disappeared. Chapter 7. The Hidden Rooms and the Secret Spaces, 1801 to 1918. Franzensburg has rooms tourists never see, never saw, were never meant to see. Private family apartments, medical chambers, storage spaces, areas reserved exclusively for Habsburg family use. These rooms contain the castle's actual secrets, not theatrical mysteries designed for tourist entertainment, but real evidence of genetic catastrophe and its management. The medical chambers were practical necessity that Franz included from initial design. Habsburg family members suffered chronic health problems requiring constant medical attention. The castle needed facilities for treatment, spaces where doctors could work away from public view, where the family's physical problems could be addressed privately without exposing disabilities to court observers or tourists. These rooms contained medical equipment, contemporary to early 19th century, examination tables, pharmaceutical supplies, the instruments physicians used to treat epilepsy, manage hydrocephalus, address the various physical manifestations of inbreeding. Not decorative medieval fantasy. Clinical modern reality tucked away where visitors wouldn't see it. When Ferdinand visited Franzensburg, rarely because his disabilities made travel difficult and his limited understanding meant he couldn't appreciate the fantasy, these medical rooms became essential. His seizures required immediate response. His hydrocephalus needed monitoring for dangerous pressure changes. His various disabilities required management by physicians traveling with him. The medical staff needed workspace. The emperor's condition needed absolute privacy. The private family quarters revealed different secrets, personal spaces where Habsburgs could be themselves without maintaining public performance. where disabilities weren't hidden or minimized, where mental illness was acknowledged among family members, where the genetic burden was visible and discussed honestly even while being denied publicly. Letters between Habsburg family members, those that survive in archives, discuss these issues in coded language and careful euphemisms. Nervous conditions, family illness, hereditary weakness, episodes. Everyone knew what these phrases meant. Nobody stated the reality directly even in private correspondence. But the acknowledgement was there beneath the euphemisms. The mental health issues that affected multiple family members required discreet management. Depression was common across Habsburg relatives. Some developed what contemporary accounts describe as paranoia, excessive suspicion, belief in persecution, fear of conspiracy. Others showed behavioral problems, sudden rages, periods of withdrawal, erratic decision-making. The exact modern psychiatric diagnoses are impossible to determine from historical records. But the pattern is unmistakable. The genetic burden affected neurological function and psychological stability, as well as physical health. These issues required careful handling, discretion, sometimes confinement. Some family members experiencing severe episodes were essentially isolated, not imprisoned. The language was always gentle, the justifications always medical. Resting for health reasons, recovering from nervous exhaustion, requiring privacy during treatment. But the reality was removal from public view until behavior stabilized. Franzensburg's isolation made it useful for this purpose. Island location, controlled access via single bridge. The family member could be at the castle for rest and recreation while actually being quietly confined away from Vienna's public scrutiny. The romantic castle that was Franz's escape became occasional discreet confinement facility for relatives whose conditions couldn't be displayed publicly. Records hint at specific incidents without providing clear details. Contemporary accounts mention family members indisposed at Franzensburg for extended periods. Medical bills archived show expenses for treatments without specifying nature of problems treated. The documentation uses intentional vagueness, but the pattern suggests mental health crises managed away from public observation. Dr. Katrin Keller is a historian at the University of Vienna whose research focuses on Habsburg court life, family dynamics, and the reality behind official presentations of royal families. The Habsburg family was trapped between public fiction and private reality. Publicly, they had to maintain image of healthy, capable dynasty suitable for ruling multi-ethnic empire. Privately, they dealt with consequences of generations of inbreeding, physical disabilities, mental illness, chronic health crises. The disconnect was enormous and psychologically damaging. Franzensburg's hidden spaces reveal that disconnect architecturally. The public areas perform medieval romance and Habsburg glory. The private areas dealt with genetic catastrophe and medical crisis. Same building, completely different functions. The relationship between castle's public fantasy and private reality is psychologically complex and revealing. The family lived in fake medieval castle built to escape modernity while simultaneously dealing with very modern medical problems, played at knights and nobility in ceremonial spaces while managing genetic diseases in medical rooms. The contrast was stark. The denial was massive. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain both realities simultaneously must have been extraordinary. Some family members recognized this contradiction. Personal diaries that survive occasionally acknowledge the absurdity. Living in theatrical medieval castle while suffering epileptic seizures, playing dress-up in reproduction armor while physicians treat hereditary conditions, hosting romantic banquets while privately managing mental health crises. The disconnect was sometimes noted explicitly, usually ignored or rationalized. Others embraced fantasy completely, seemed to genuinely believe in the medieval romance, used Castle's fantasy world to escape from their reality completely, dressed in costumes with enthusiasm, attended theatrical banquets eagerly, participated fully in the performance without apparent recognition of contradiction. The denial became total. The beautiful lie replaced reality entirely in their psychology. The division between public and private spaces at Franzensburg was absolute and carefully maintained. Tourists saw Knight's Hall with its partly fake armor, chapel with its questionably authentic stained glass, treasury with its dubiously provenanced relics, the beautiful medieval fantasy spaces. They never saw medical rooms, private apartments, spaces dealing with actual genetic consequences. The separation was both architectural and psychological. Walls divided the spaces physically. Denial divided them psychologically. This created strange juxtapositions that household staff witnessed but never publicly discussed. Tourists admiring medieval stained glass in chapel while family member in private wing dealt with seizure. Visitors examining reproduction armor in Knight's Hall while physician in medical room treated hereditary condition. Beauty and dysfunction coexisting, separated by stone walls and loyal silence. But both equally real, both part of Franzensburg's truth. The servants who worked at Franzensburg knew everything, saw the private reality, the medical interventions, the family's actual conditions, the disabilities managed behind scenes. But they were carefully selected for loyalty and discretion. Habsburg employment required absolute silence about family matters. The secrets stayed internal by necessity and severe consequences for disclosure. After 1918, after Habsburg fall and exile, these private spaces were discovered by Austrian Republican government taking inventory of confiscated properties. Catalogued, documented to some extent, but much was destroyed or suppressed. The new government had no interest in publicizing detailed evidence of Habsburg genetic problems. Some records were preserved in state archives. Others were destroyed as irrelevant or potentially embarrassing. What survives suggests the genetic problems were worse than publicly acknowledged, even in hindsight. More family members affected than official histories admit. More severe conditions than sanitized accounts describe. More medical intervention required than decorative family illness phrases suggest. The beautiful public image concealed catastrophic private reality more thoroughly than even critical historians initially realized. Modern medical and genetic analysis of Habsburg remains confirms this when possible. The physical evidence, skeletal remains, preserved organs, medical specimens, shows extreme inbreeding effects when analyzed with modern technology. Genetic studies demonstrate the concentration of harmful recessive genes. Physical analysis reveals deformities and pathologies consistent with severe inbreeding depression. The private medical reality aligns with modern scientific understanding in ways that confirm the worst interpretations. Franzensburg embodies this duality at architectural level. Public spaces are fantasy, fake medieval beauty performing Habsburg glory. Private spaces are clinical reality, medical rooms addressing genetic catastrophe. The castle itself represents Habsburg existence in microcosm. Beautiful facade concealing dysfunction, romantic performance hiding genetic disaster, medieval cosplay masking modern medical crisis, theatrical presentation and terrible reality coexisting in same structure. The hidden rooms are rarely shown to modern tourists. Austrian state maintains some privacy even posthumously, preserves family dignity by not displaying spaces where medical crises were managed. The medical chambers are storage now. The private apartments are closed to public. The secrets remain somewhat secret even 2 centuries later. But they exist architecturally, physical evidence of what the beautiful facade concealed. rooms where reality couldn't be denied even while being publicly rejected, where genetic consequences were managed even while being officially unacknowledged, where the dynasty's actual condition was treated even while official propaganda proclaimed health and vigor. The contradiction is perfect and permanent. The fairytale castle that tourists see was built around clinical spaces managing genetic catastrophe. The medieval romance was constructed atop modern medical crisis. The beautiful lie contained ugly truth, literally. Same building, different rooms, both essential to understanding what Franzensburg really was. The fantasy and the disease, the performance and the pathology, public denial and private treatment, all coexisting, all true, all preserved in architecture even when hidden from visitors. The castle speaks truth about Habsburgs even while lying theatrically, tells the story through what it hides as much as what it displays. And that makes it more honest than many genuine medieval castles, because Franzensburg reveals its builder's psychology completely: the need to escape, the genetic burden, the denial mechanisms, the beautiful lies necessary for psychological survival. All there in the architecture, if you know where to look, what the hidden rooms meant, why they were necessary. The fake castle concealing real secrets. The theatrical set hiding clinical reality. The beautiful lie built around terrible truth. That's Franzensburg's actual story. More revealing than any medieval fortress, because the fakeness itself reveals Habsburg psychology completely. Chapter 8. The Austrian State and the Question of What to Do with Beautiful Lies, 1918 to present. November 1918. The Habsburg dynasty is exiled, their properties confiscated. Franzensburg becomes Austrian state property, and the new Republican government faces question: what to do with elaborate fake medieval castle built by fallen dynasty? The initial impulse among some revolutionaries: destroy it. Franzensburg represents everything the Republic opposes: aristocratic excess, wasted resources, elaborate fantasy while peasants suffered, monarchist nostalgia. Symbols of discredited old regime should be eliminated, not preserved. But pragmatism and cultural value arguments prevail. Franzensburg is significant architecturally despite being fake. Represents important moment in European historicism. Demonstrates early 19th century artistic techniques. Has tourism potential generating revenue for struggling new state? Destroying it would waste valuable asset without achieving any practical political goal. Decision is made: preserve and repurpose. Make it state museum, educational site about Habsburg history and 19th century Romantic movement. Tourist attraction that acknowledges the fakeness while celebrating the craftsmanship. Use the castle to teach about dynasties' decline rather than glorify their power. This creates immediate challenge: how to present fake castle honestly while maintaining its appeal. How to acknowledge its theatrical set while preserving the atmospheric fantasy that makes it interesting. How to educate visitors about Habsburg delusions without destroying the romantic experience. Austrian curators through 1920s develop approach that becomes template. Acknowledge the artificial nature explicitly. Label it Romantic Historicist Architecture in Materials. Explain Franz II's motivations and psychological state. Discuss 19th century medievalism as cultural phenomenon. Present the fakeness as part of the story, not embarrassing secret to hide. This works reasonably well. Visitors understand they're seeing theatrical construction from 1801, not genuine medieval castle. But they appreciate the artistry anyway. The craftsmanship, the theatrical design, the psychological insight into Habsburg decline. The fakeness becomes interesting because it's fake, not despite being fake. Tourism through interwar period is steady. not enormous. Franzensburg is never as famous as Schönbrunn or Hofburg palaces, but respectable. The castle generates useful revenue for Austrian state, helps maintain itself through admission fees, justifies continued preservation expense. World War II brings crisis. Austria annexed by Nazi Germany, 1938. Castle becomes German state property. Nazis have complicated relationship with Habsburg monuments, ideologically opposed to Austrian dynasty, but appreciating Germanic medieval aesthetics. Franzensburg is maintained but not prioritized, receives minimal upkeep. War damage is fortunately minimal. Laxenburg's location, suburban Vienna, not strategically important, means it's not bombed or fought over. Castle survives war physically intact. Some looting of portable items, some damage from neglected maintenance, but structure remains sound. Post-war, Austria is reconstructed as independent republic. Franzensburg returns to Austrian state control. Tourism resumes, increases significantly through 1950s and 60s as European economy recovers and leisure travel expands. Castle becomes established tourist destination. The artifact collection requires careful re-examination. During Habsburg period, real and fake were deliberately mixed without distinction. Now, modern museum standards require accurate labeling, honest provenance, scientific authentication. Austrian curators begin systematic analysis. This reveals the extent of mixing. Approximately half the medieval artifacts are genuinely period-appropriate, authenticated through documentation, scientific testing, provenance research. The other half are either reproductions created for Franzensburg or items of dubious authenticity purchased in questionable circumstances. Some pieces remain undeterminable, could be genuine, could be skilled fakes, evidence insufficient for confident attribution. Modern presentation acknowledges this explicitly. Labels indicate authenticated medieval 15th century or reproduction created circa 1805 or provenance uncertain, possibly 16th century or 19th century reproduction. The honesty is dramatic contrast with Franz's approach, but it serves modern museum ethics while actually enhancing educational value. Visitors learn about authentication challenges and historical artifact markets as well as medieval objects themselves. The architecture itself requires ongoing conservation. The theatrical construction techniques, plaster over brick painted to look like stone, create specific preservation challenges. Water infiltration damages plaster. Temperature fluctuations cause cracking. The artificial aging applied in 1801 now requires preservation. Ironic task of conserving deliberately manufactured decay. Modern conservation techniques allow sophisticated intervention. Structural analysis identifies weakness. Climate control systems protect vulnerable materials. Modern compounds stabilize historic plaster without visible alteration. The castle is maintained to 21st century museum standards while preserving 19th century theatrical appearance. Scientific analysis of artifacts continues advancing. Each decade brings new testing methods, more sophisticated chemical analysis, better dating techniques, more precise authentication. The collection is gradually being documented comprehensively with increasing confidence about what's genuine versus reproduction. This reveals Franz's collection was better than might be expected. He did acquire substantial amounts of genuine medieval material, purchased from legitimate sources when monasteries were dissolved, bought from reputable collectors. His collection wasn't entirely fraudulent, but he also accepted questionable pieces without rigorous verification. Needed to believe they were genuine. Didn't investigate too carefully when dealers offered authenticated medieval artifacts of dubious provenance. The hidden medical rooms and private family spaces are now storage and administrative areas, not displayed publicly. Austrian state maintains some posthumous family privacy. Doesn't exhibit spaces where genetic disasters were managed as tourist attraction. The dignity consideration is genuine but also practical. Medical crisis management isn't compelling museum content the way theatrical medieval fantasy is. But the existence of these spaces is acknowledged in scholarly literature and detailed guidebooks. Visitors who want deeper understanding can learn about private medical reality behind public fantasy. The story is told honestly even though the physical spaces aren't publicly accessible. Tourism numbers have grown steadily. Current annual visitors approximately 50,000. Not enormous compared to major Vienna palaces, but solid for suburban historical site. The castle has found sustainable niche, not pretending to be something it isn't. Being honest about what it is, fake medieval castle, beautiful lie, monument to Habsburg psychological escape, architectural theater of remarkable craftsmanship. The castle's maintenance is ongoing and expensive. Austrian Cultural Ministry allocates significant budget annually. Preservation work is continuous. Modern conservation is more sophisticated but also more expensive than historical maintenance. The investment is considered worthwhile for cultural and tourism value. Educational programming has expanded. School groups visit. Academic conferences use the castle as case study in historicism, dynasty psychology, architectural theater. The fake castle becomes teaching tool precisely because it's fake. Illustrates how architecture communicates ideology, how aesthetics serve psychological needs, how buildings embody cultural anxieties. Franzensburg stands on its artificial island in Laxenburg Park, still performing medieval castle for tourists who now understand the performance, still mixing genuine medieval artifacts with acknowledged reproductions, still representing Habsburg psychology through architectural fantasy, still beautiful despite being fake, still fascinating because it's fake. The dynasty that built it is gone, exiled, scattered, politically irrelevant. The empire it represented collapsed century ago. The beautiful lie outlasted everything true. The theatrical set proved more durable than political reality it was built to escape. And modern Austria maintains it carefully, preserves the fantasy honestly, acknowledges the deception while celebrating the craft, uses the fake castle to teach real history about Habsburg decline, genetic catastrophe, psychological denial, architectural ideology, 19th century romanticism. The beautiful lie serves truth by being honest about being lie. The fake castle reveals reality by admitting its fakeness. Franzensburg's greatest achievement is being perfectly dishonest architecture that tells complete truth about its builders. The castle where Fairytale concealed genetic catastrophe, where medieval fantasy masked modern medical crisis. Franzensburg, Austria's strangest castle, most dishonest architecture, most revealing monument.